The title of the webinar is Introduction to Climate Change Adaptation and Urban Mobility Planning. Here with you today, it's myself, Zosia Buchinska, and Milnael Gomez, our guest speaker.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here today and, of course, to meet you all for this webinar.
So the training materials and the webinar used today have been created and developed jointly with Mobilize Your City Partnership and ADEME. So just before we start, I'll quickly go over some housekeeping rules. So this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Mobilize Your City YouTube channel. So if you do not wish to appear on the recording, please keep your cameras turned off and microphone muted. If you have any questions at any given point during the session, just please raise your hand and unmute yourself and speak once you are asked to. And also at the very end, we're going to have a Q&A session, so you can pop your questions in the chat and I'll keep a lookout for them. And yes. Okay. So yeah, for those who aren't familiar, Mobilize Your City is a global partnership with members on 4 continents. We have partnered with 70 cities, 16 countries, and are constructed via 6 donors. Mobilize Your City was launched in COP21 in Paris and works to accelerate the transition towards sustainable urban mobility. And if you would like to read more about Mobilize Your City and the work, we've recently launched the 2024 Global Monitor, which you can access using the link at the bottom of the slide or on our website. Yes, so this is the first webinar from a series of webinars that we aim to host about climate change adaptation. In total, we are going to plan 4 sessions, including this one. The ones to follow are principles to include climate change adaptation and urban mobility, including climate change adaptation on sump and NUMP cycle, and measures and actions to adapt urban mobility to climate change. And so we're planning to have the next sessions ready within 6 to 8 months, so please be on the lookout for them. But of course, we will let you know as soon as we are ready with the content. Okay, so to introduce the session a little better, we have 5 learning objectives. The first is to provide foundational knowledge on climate change impacts on urban mobility and adaptive strategies, to increase awareness of climate change adaptation and urban mobility planning, to identify specific city requirements for climate change adaptation and urban mobility, to showcase diverse sources and methods for developing adaptation strategies, and finally, to illustrate climate change adaptation stages through an interactive case study. Regarding the structure of the session, so we first began by the welcome and housekeeping information. We will then have our expert explain what climate change is, and then link climate change adaptation with mobility. And at the end, we will have a Q&A session where you'll be able to ask any questions, ideas, and feedback that you will have, and we'll have a short farewell. So with us here today is our speaker, Milnael Gomez, who is a climate change adaptation expert working at Mobilize Your City Secretariat. And myself, I am moderating this webinar, and I work alongside Milnael in Mobilize Your City Secretariat in the capacity building team. Okay, so just quickly, before I let our experts speak, I wanted to do a quick ice-breaking and warm-up exercise. So here you have a list of factors that relate to urban mobility. And what I would like you to do is to rate these factors from a climate change perspective, rating them from minor, medium to high importance. And you can do so, you can rate them, I'll pop them now in the chat, and then you can rate them with the corresponding emoji. So I'll just give you a moment to read through them, and I'll just put them in the chat, and then you can react. All right. Okay, so it seems it's sort of a tie. Everyone's saying, oh, no, actually, interruption of services so far is seen to be the highest importance. So that's very interesting to see you guys, your reactions. But now to introduce the topic a little better, I am giving the floor to our expert, Milnael. So Milnael, please go ahead.
Yeah, So, good morning, everyone. My name is Midnight Gomez. I work at MobiliseYourCity as a climate change adaptation specialist. We've been working in this topic because we consider it a really important one, and we would like to start first with an introduction on what is climate change. Maybe for a lot of people that is already in the meeting, around 12 to 14 people that are already here. You already know what is climate change, but the idea is just to have like a quick recap on what it is and why it's important to adapt to climate change. And we will continue also to understand why it's important for mobility to adapt to climate change, and of course the infrastructure itself that affects us every day in our daily life. So, starting with the definitions, where climate change refers to the long-term shift in the temperatures and weather patterns that have happened according to the pre-industrial area, mostly caused by the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. We already know it's a huge problem worldwide that has been caused by the industrialization itself, but of course the effects have been showing and popping up all over the world. And the effects of climate change can be extreme weather events, for instance, more intense or frequent hurricanes, floods, heat waves, and droughts as well. And the leads to sea level rise and coastal erosion. So we know that, for instance, some island states are in risk of disappear because of the rise of sea level, for instance. And also, of course, what is the adaptation to climate change? And it's important to have this concept clear for the webinar itself, is how to properly cope with the different effects that we are going to have right now or in the future regarding the climate change extreme events. So if we know that we're going to have more rain, or more extreme rain events, what are we going to do? How are we going to prepare our cities and our mobility infrastructure and services in order to deal with that? That's a really important remark. And the resilience is the capacity itself to properly anticipate and manage the climate impact. So once you start to adapt, you also start to increase the resilience. That's the idea behind it. And what is the current situation and what are the projections? So far, we know that 2023 was the warmest year on record, and it's been the case for the last couple of years. And we expect that trend to continue. So we will need to do some actions in order to adapt to the climate change. Of course, we also know that we are not on track to meet the Paris Agreement, so we strongly need to reduce the emissions in order to avoid a further increasing of the temperature worldwide. So far, we are around 1.5 Celsius degrees. And the climate events that you more or less already know, I mean, perhaps you have already experienced so far, but we're going to see it a little bit more in detail, is the sea level rise. So there are some cities that are more prone to have this kind of consequences or issues. For instance, according to this study from Statista, we have that according to Celsius degrees warming, the 16% of population of Tokyo, 39% of population of Shanghai, or 30% of population of Hanoi is going to be affected by the sea levels, the sea rising levels. So that's just to give you an idea on how important this could be in the future in the upcoming years. And of course, we have an immediate effect. So what happens right when the sea level starts to rise? Also a short term, which means that now the coast will be more vulnerable, and a long term, that is when whole areas will be below the sea level, or either constantly or when there's a high tide. Of course, we also have floods. So we have the pluvial flood, just caused by intense rainfall events, the river flood that is caused by the heavy rainfall, but when it goes to the river and the river cannot have the capacity to evacuate all the water, and the coastal flood that is similar or caused by the sea level rising, either by high tides that can happen in a hurricane or by permanent flooding. We also have extreme precipitations, and extreme precipitations cause the increase of flood levels in rivers and also in general in the cities just after one event. Extreme storms as hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones that are expected to be more intense in the coming future, caused by the climate mostly. Also, extreme temperatures, either hot or cold, that can have some impacts not only in the health but also in the health of the people, which is tremendously important, but also in the infrastructure. So if an infrastructure becomes unavailable because there is an extreme event of temperature, either because it's too hot or too cold, that's also an effect of climate change. Heat waves, when we have more than 3 days of abnormally hot weather, and especially on the upper 40s or near 40 degrees, then it starts to be called a heat wave, and it has some consequences, especially considering the urban heat island effect. So we would like to do this interactive part as well with you, and it's just to understand a little bit more on which type of effects have you feel so far according to your local uh, uh, your local experience. If you have seen perhaps an increase of the sea level, some floods, regardless if they have been pluvial or just a river or coastal floods, also extreme precipitations, extreme storms, and extreme temperatures or heat waves. So Sosh is going to help us just doing a similar exercise as the warming up, and we are going to know which type of events have you felt that have been the most important or frequent or also rarely as well. If you think that that's not the case in your city, that also helps to understand a little bit better on what's happening. We will give you around 2 to 3 minutes just to react to the different events, and then we will continue with the webinar. So we have extreme precipitations, extreme storms, also heat waves. Will copies of all presentations be sent to participants? Well, I will answer this question. Yeah, the idea will be that the webinar itself is going to be published in the YouTube session. So yes, indeed, it can be available. Sea level rise as a non-frequent, sea level rise. Okay, so we have floods specifically, mostly, and heat waves. Okay, and extreme precipitations and floods. Okay, so maybe we can continue. Then it is important to understand why do we need to include climate change adaptation in the mobility planning. And with this regard, we have 4 elements that we consider are the most important so far from our perspective. Of course, and can be different approaches, but so far what we have identified is that it's important to safeguard the communities from the impact of climate events. And this is the case every time that you see some news about an extreme climate event that is happening in your city or in your country. And it's the case everywhere, regardless of the country, to be honest. Also, important to understand that there are vulnerable populations, especially those that are living in poverty or under extreme circumstances that face heightened risks. And that's the case also in general for climate change events. So vulnerable populations are particularly vulnerable to this kind of events. It's important also to reduce the vulnerability of the mobility infrastructure of climate hazards in the city. And that includes the current infrastructure that we have, but also the infrastructure that we need to build in the future. So it's not just what we have right now, but what we will do in the future as well. Also important to improve the emergency response once a climate event has happened. So it's important to reduce the consequences once the climate event has happened, and therefore it's important to have a better emergency response. That, of course, includes that we would like to increase the resilience of our system, and also to make sure that the transportation systems are sustainable and that they are prioritizing the well-being of all residents. Then we can start with the second session, the second part, that refers specifically to the climate change adaptation and mobility. And it's important to understand why to consider climate change adaptation. Also, what is the assessment framework or the risk assessment framework? We will show also a case study in Bangalore in India, and finally an exercise that we will do together in order to understand a little bit better the concept that we are presenting so far. So first of all, why to consider climate change adaptation? And therefore, I will say the first thing is to consider that transport is the major driver of climate change worldwide, is the fourth sector of greenhouse gas emissions for 2016, and is expected to increase more than proportional compared to all the other sectors. So if we don't do anything regarding this element, we are going to keep increasing our emissions. So we know that it is a problem itself because it's a major driver of climate change. And also, most vulnerable countries are in the global south that, according to MobiliseYourCity geographies, they overlap. So we have countries in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa that are more vulnerable to climate change. And we also work in a lot of those countries. So that's also a perfect call for action for us in order to understand that our cities and our countries require specifically some actions on climate change adaptation. And we are going to show that with some examples from the cities that we have been working on. For instance, in Bouaké, in Ivory Coast, by 2014, only 20% of the road network was paved, and that's an issue because if you don't have like enough infrastructure for emergency response and also for the mobility of the inhabitants, then you will be more vulnerable to climate change. Also, the most vulnerable people, as you can see, for instance, in the picture, they don't have the perfect or ideal infrastructure for them to walk or to cycle in a city. So in this case, for instance, we don't have sidewalks, and a lady with her kid has to be in the street walking near the cars. And of course, that's vulnerable not only for road safety reasons, but also because in case of a heat wave or a high temperature or a raining event, she's going to be more vulnerable. But of course, this also means an opportunity for us to create projects and include climate change adaptation within the planning that we are already doing in our cities. For instance, in this case, in Douala in Cameroon, out of 500 million euros that are expected to be invested in the upcoming years up to 2030, according to the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan that we have developed with this city, 300 million euros are expected to be invested in public transport, which includes a cable car, a bus infrastructure, and also some rolling stock for the infrastructure, and also in non-motorized modes. So that represents an opportunity in order to also include climate change adaptation measures that are additional, not that expensive, but with a high return in the future when we consider the climate change impacts on the infrastructure. We also have that the conditions on our cities are changing. And for instance, in Santo Domingo, in Dominican Republic, we have that there has been a huge increase on extreme rain events in the last decade by 20%. But also, there are two main natural disasters. From one side, the climatic events, which includes hurricanes, floodings, and droughts, and the associated impacts of those events, and also some seismic events that, of course, we cannot cope with that with earthquakes or landslides caused by earthquakes, but we can focus on those climate events and how to adapt to those events. In another example, in Medan, in Indonesia, we have that there are some risks associated with volcanoes, landslides, earthquakes, droughts, and floods. And in the last 20 years, which is the main concern right now, there have been some effects caused by climate change that can be seen in intense floods and also soil risks, because we have now drier, warm seasons, and when the rainy season starts, all the soil is not compacted, and it can happen a landslide. So that has been the case in Medan, in Indonesia. Of course, that climate change adaptation requires also governance, and it is important to understand that there are different levels of government with different competences, and also that the climate change is affecting not only one specific city, but perhaps a whole region or a whole country. In this regard, it is important to keep working towards a coordinated approach and a coordinated response from all the different stakeholders and levels of government before and after a climate event happens. And we need to understand that this is a process that it's going to keep happening, but we also need to keep learning. So it's not a static process when we will have all the answers right now, and we will keep doing everything and it will be perfect in the upcoming years. But it's a process that we need to keep learning, because the events are going to change. We don't know certainly what are going to be the events in a specific area. We know with some level of probability, but we don't know for sure what's going to happen in the future. And we need to learn and evolve. And that's the case, for instance, in Nagpur in Indonesia, which represents a big opportunity in order to keep working on introducing the climate change adaptation in the planning of mobility. Regarding this aspect, we also did an analysis on the sounds that have been developed so far by MobiliseYourCity, and we identified that most of them don't include actions on climate change adaptation, just one in Ambato in Ecuador, and some of them, just 4 of them, include a diagnosis on climate change, vulnerability, and risks, which is the case of Douala, Medan, Santo Domingo, and Riadawa. So far, we also did that with the National Urban Mobility Plans on sustainable mobility. And out of 6 complete Mobilize Your City NOMs with final documents that we have reviewed, only 1 of them includes a diagnosis on greenhouse gas emissions and air quality. That means that no actions on climate change adaptation has been developed so far. So that represents also an opportunity. But how do we consider that, and how do we actually assess the risk of urban climate change? So first, we need to understand what are the hazards, and the hazards have been presented so far in this webinar as the sea level rise, the floods, the precipitations, the storms, the different changes in temperature, and also the heat waves. So that's the event itself, the climate event. We can consider it as a hazard, because something that can happen that is, in this case, natural, but due to a human induced this a change in the atmosphere, and that can cause some impacts on the daily life in a specific area. We also have the vulnerability, and this refers on how is currently the infrastructure being adapted or can cope with this kind of events. For instance, we have a sidewalk that maybe when it starts to rain, when it starts to pour rain, it's really hard to use the sidewalk. The same can happen with roads, or if we don't have a good drainage system, can also happen with roads, or if we have a heat wave and we don't have enough shadow in a bus stop, it's really hard to be there just waiting for a bus. Maybe you would like to take another mode of transportation, and that refers to the vulnerability. So all the different elements that we have already in the city that are there that can amplify or diminish the effects of climate change hazards. Also, of course, the population size and the density and the topography of a city. For instance, if we have a flat city, it's going to be different than a city that is very hilly and also that can have some landslides. And finally, the third component is the response capacity. And the response capacity is what actually we can work on and what we can do in order to properly cope with climate change. So when all those three factors melt together, we have the risk. And the risk is usually measured as the probability of an event to happen, and also what are going to be the different risks on the infrastructure according to those events and the vulnerability and the response capacity that we have. That happens for events. That's the case for before an event happens, but also after an event. So if we don't have the capacity to recover back to normal in the upcoming hours or days after an event, then the risk is higher and higher. And of course, this causes cost for the city, for the infrastructure, and for the citizens as well. And we finally have also the impacts, and is once we have the risk that materializes, we call it impacts. So we actually see it in our city when something happened. That's the impact itself from climate change. But we need to understand that there are some components of the urban transport system, which include the infrastructure, the vehicles, the users, also the operations of the vehicles, and the regulations and policies, as well as some technological systems that can be used and useful for climate change adaptation. We also need to understand that there is a direct relationship with other systems in the city. And that's also part of an holistic approach that can consider the city as a whole. So, for instance, we have dependencies with the energy sector, with the water sector, and the governance, of course, because understanding what's happening and what's going on within each level of governance is important to properly provide a response for climate change adaptation. That's the case, for instance, with water, with the drainage system or the water supply for the system operation itself. For the energy, for instance, that we have the traffic lights and also the electrified modes, which can be trams, metros, or electric buses. And also for the oil depots and refineries that are required. So for instance, if we have a blockage because it's no longer possible to access to an oil depot, then also the system is going to be affected because it's no longer going to be functioning. And with communications, if we have some disruptions on communications and internet services, the operation itself is going to suffer. We would like to present this case study from Bangalore based on Vajrapu, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, in 2020. Even though it's a mm, it's a case from India that maybe is not going to be related to your city, we think that maybe some of the elements are common to some other geographies worldwide, and we would like to present it because of that. So first, a little bit of information about Bangalore is that it's the capital of the Indian state of Karnataka, and it's one of the largest urban centers in India. So the third most populous city in India and the fifth most populous urban agglomeration in India. And that, of course, implies that the city has a huge population, currently around 13, 14 million people, but it has been increased by 2 million every 5 years since 2015 and up to 2035. So by 2035, the city is expected to have 18 million people. That has been an increase of more than of around 100% just in 20 years. That implies also an increase on the urban area and the built-up area in the city, which has multiplied by 3 in around 40 years. So in this case, we can see the area, and it has increased from a small city in 1973, and in 2006 it was already a whole city that covered all the vegetation is no longer present. Also, there are no water bodies here. For instance, you can see that they are starting to disappear more and more, and now they are not there. And of course, that has some implications on climate change, because now the city is not going to be able to store some water when a rain event happens. Also, in the case of Bangalore, there has been some changes in the raining patterns. So there was a heavy raining in 2017, um, which flooded some of the sections of the city, and that left many residents stranded at homes, and it was impossible to use the transportation system. So if we can see in this street, we see that people cannot walk anymore. They do it because they have to, but it's definitely not a comfortable situation. Also, this person here cannot use his motorcycle anymore. It's really hard to get by car or by bus in this street. And as we expect this to happen more frequently and more intense, it's important to understand what can we do in order to help mitigate the impacts. In the case of Bangalore, it also had a difficult relationship with the drainage system. So it hasn't been clean in a while. So let's say it like this. That's the case for a lot of cities, and regardless of the continent, regardless of the country, but we will need to also take care into account in order to adapt to climate change. And according to the information that we just presented, we would like to do this exercise on which are the hazards, which are the vulnerabilities, and also the response capacity, and to understand a little bit better how it works to get the risk. Of course, we're not going to go into the numbers, that's not the idea, just like a quick review on what has been happening in Bangalore. So from one side, we have the hazards, and it has mostly change on precipitation, or at least for this case study. We also have the vulnerability, which is the changes on the population and the infrastructure, and also the drainage system. So we already saw that in the previous slides, and the idea is that you also take this exercise in your mind already to participate in the exercise that we're proposing for this webinar. Then we have the impacts, which are the physical impacts, the increase in travel times. If we need to change the route, for instance, because it's no longer accessible, or if we have congestion because of the low speeds, or any other impact that you can imagine caused by those changes on precipitations and by the changes also on vulnerability. As the response capacity hasn't been changed, we can immediately assume that the risk has increased, because now we have more precipitation. Now we have a bigger city that doesn't have any area to gather the water for these changes on precipitations. And also there are some issues with the drainage system and some other elements. So we have the first scenario, which is no flooding at all. Then we have the worst case condition, which is the flooding, and similar to 2017. And what happens if we increase the response capacity? So that will be the adaptation policy, and that will be the different scenario that we would like to model in order to understand what can we do to increase the response capacity. So I'm going to skip this slide just for the sake of simplicity, also this one, but just to tell you that the idea was to model all the different scenarios in a conventional transport model software, and to also overlap it with the areas that were flooded in 2017 according to a specific event, which is a 100 years return event. So that a rainfall that is expected to have every 100 years. And we have three different set of policies that can be our adaptation scenarios. So in the first one, we have the replacement of impermeable road surface with permeable material in vulnerable areas. So in that case, we have just pavement. We would like to have some more absorbing material, more permeable material that is just not pavement, but also, for instance, some trees in the sidewalks, or some sustainable drainage system can be as well. The second the second element in this policy bundle is the slum relocation and rehabilitation. It's just for the most vulnerable people, also providing proper drainage facilities at vulnerable areas and the construction of redundant infrastructure. So in that case, if we have two sidewalks, let's say, in each side of the road, if one of the sidewalks is not working anymore because it's flooding, we still have the other one. Like that would be similar to this case. But in a global scale for a city, then you will need more infrastructure here and there that can be used specifically when there is not enough infrastructure because it's not available because of the climate event. On the second policy bundle, we have the rerouting of the people during the flooding, so more information for the people in order to deal with the flooding. Restricting the development in low-lying or vulnerable areas, and also the slum relocation and rehabilitation. The third policy, we have the replacement of impermeable road surface, as I mentioned before, providing proper drainage system, also as I mentioned before, and the rerouting people during flooding. So we have these three set of policies just to check which one can be modeled better and can have a better impact. So which one would you think is the best scenario? So I will give you around 1 minute just to mention if you will say, is the adoption policy number 1, number 2, or number 3? And you can just answer in the chat. And yeah, just very, very quickly, if you think that there is one of those policies that can be that can have the best scenario. Specifically, when we look to these indicators, the vehicle kilometers travel, the vehicle travel speeds, and the average trip lengths. So the total number of kilometers that have been traveled, the average speed for the vehicles, and what is the trip length? So if you have to make a detour, then your trip length is going to increase. That's more or less the idea. If you cannot do the trip, well, you can no longer do the trip, but the idea is to always try to do the trip, but in a different configuration. So from the results of the modulation, we have that the scenario number 1 has a better impact because if we have the no flooding scenario and the flooding scenario, we see that there has been an increase of more than 3 million kilometers. What does this imply? So in this case, the increase in kilometers is because of detours that now people will have to do because they are not longer in an infrastructure that is accessible. But with the first scenario, we don't have that problem anymore. Then with the average travel speeds, it happens the same. So it doesn't decrease as much as with the no flooding, as the flooding scenario. So it just decreases around 5 kilometers per hour compared to almost 10 kilometers per hour in the no flooding versus flooding scenario. Regarding the travel speeds, we also see that the impact is not that big. So it's just 12% more or 10% more, sorry, a 12% less or 10% less compared to the flooding scenario. So in that case, it means that yes, we don't have an issue, a big issue anymore. So within this case study, and before going to the exercise, we identify that the different scenarios can be modeled and can be identified in order to understand what are the impacts on the key performance indicators that have been analyzed. On the second conclusion, I would like to mention that the availability of information was really important in order to understand what are the impacts and to assess the scenarios. That includes, of course, to having a fully transport model, which is not the case for a lot of cities. In this case, because it was a big city, it was available. The topography information, understanding which areas are more prone to flood. The flooding information as well, to understand what were the events that happened in the past, what are the events that are expected to happen in the future, and what are the impacts of those events. But also, a lot of questions can arise. What elements should be considered in diagnose, how to select the measures, and which resources should be allocated? And the idea with all those questions is that, as you can see, the topic is quite big, and we are not going to deal with all those questions in this webinar, but we are going to also answer those questions in the series of webinars. So this is just the introduction on understanding why it's important and what are the effects. But now, what do we need to do, and how do we take a decision, an informed decision, in order to properly develop the actions that our cities require? So now we're going to, and yeah, that's for the series of webinars on climate change adaptation. As Sosha was saying before, the idea is to have them in the upcoming 6 to 8 months, so in this year. And you are, of course, very invited to come to the following series of webinars regarding the principles of climate change adaptation, also to understanding how to include it into the SUM and NUM cycle, and which are the actions that can help us to adapt to climate change in urban mobility. And the idea is now that you also take the role and take a little bit the lead on the exercise. So the idea is to have the first question, and you more or less already answered this question. What changes on hazards or vulnerabilities have you experienced in your city during the last years? So I will just open the floor so you can raise your hand, and perhaps Sosha can let us know who talk in the meantime. So the idea is that you identify which type of hazards, sea levels, floods, precipitation, storms, high or low temperatures, heat waves, or any other hazard that you have identified in your city, and what have been the changes in the vulnerabilities in your city. Changes on the infrastructure, supply chain, the population size or density, and also the topography. So I will leave you the floor, and we can start also having a little bit of conversation about 5 minutes within this regard.
If you're shy, maybe you can pop it in the chat or something.
Yes, as well. That can also work for us. If you don't want to talk, you can also write us and to understand a little bit better on which type of hazards and vulnerabilities. Also, the idea with understanding a little bit better on what are the hazards and vulnerabilities is because on the different material that we are preparing so far for Mobilize Your City, we would like to include also some of the cities that have been working with us, and to understand a little bit better on what have been the challenges that those cities have faced so far. So that will be also relevant and important for us to understand a little bit better what is the situation in the cities that we are working with, and how can we address some help or some resources or some technical capacities in order to cope with this problem that is just everywhere.
So we have someone said in the chat, floods from Kigali, Rwanda. That was one of the answers. There's also another chat mentioned that vulnerability, unplanned urban sprawl that many cities in Latin America are facing.
Yes, that's a really important remark. So for the principles that we are working with and that we are preparing jointly with some other of our knowledge network partners, that we are doing some workshops understanding what has been done and how can we also provide some guidance on which principles should be taken into account for climate change adaptation. We have identified that we cannot consider just the mobility sector, but also the land use and the urban planning. So in that case, of course, that refers specifically to the vulnerabilities, because you have changes on which type of city do you have, and how that city is adapted according to the climate change events.
So we have more coming in now. So from the case study of Jakarta, the hazard being flooding, and draining infrastructure and population density being a vulnerability.
I think Jakarta is kind of a case study on why is it important to develop these kind of actions properly. Indeed, because otherwise those events are happening and will keep happening in the future for sure. Is there any other
Someone
advice?
stopped typing.
Okay, so maybe we will wait for the last answer so far. I will continue to the second question of this exercise.
So the example is Nigeria, and then there's serious heat wave, flooding with also drainage infrastructure as a vulnerability and urban sprawl.
Okay, thank you. And the second question that we would like to have is, and also based on what we already stated in the presentation, but also in the answers that you provided, is what actions do you think, or what's your idea? What can we do in order to reduce the risk and increase the resilience on the urban mobility system? And then I would like to give you some initial ideas that you can adapt to your local context, but let's dream big and let's go for the sky, and why not uh, propose something that, even though might not be it might be too complex or something, but maybe it can be also like an interesting solution for the local context. So for instance, we can talk about the increasing the drainage capacity in a city. We can talk about increasing the presence of trees and permeable areas near the streets, so in the sidewalks or in the streets as well. We can also have some parks that can uh, gather some water while the flooding starts to disappear. So that usually for the lowlands to recuperate the former swamps and similar areas that maybe now they're being built by by vulnerable people, but they are still planned to flood because that's that has been the natural um, configuration of that area. So maybe if now we're building that area, it's going to be difficult. So I will invite you to also type in the chat or just ask us or just raise your hand, and we will be happy to listen to you or to read to you according to what do you think can be done in your city. What do you think we should need to address in order to increase the response capacity and reduce the risk of climate change events.
So we have someone who said grazing and introducing the other style of road building in a way that they can be permeable.
Yeah, that's really important. I personally consider that there has been a lot of developments in the last years on how to properly develop permeable pavements that actually can take into account the water. Yes.
So we have another one from Nigeria: provision of drainage infrastructures, adoption of electric vehicles to reduce the rate of CO2 emission.
Yes, indeed. For the drainage system, I think it's really important to first initially build the drainage system, where in cities that there's still not a drainage system, of course, and then also the maintenance of the drainage system, because otherwise it can happen that you already have built the drainage system, but if it's not properly maintained and during the dry season it starts to collect all the garbage, then by the wet season, by the raining season, it's going to be more difficult because all the garbage is going to stay there, and it can create a flood for sure. So yeah, it's important to build and also to maintain.
So we have someone who has raised their hand.
Yes, please.
So if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Hirgo Francois Regis, and I'm from Rwanda. So Kigali, Rwanda, as I mentioned. So am I audible enough?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. For me, So what I think is a good solution for the hazards and some of the complications that we normally have in cities as we develop. So I've seen a challenge of um, misunderstandings or people like the way people behave. I think they have to rethink the way they behave. While, for instance, they are owning the car, if I can have such one example. So when you are buying a car, why are you buying a car? So I think there should be maybe a policy that can remit people to buy their own private cars. So that will make us not build unnecessary roads, which results to floodings and also misuse of it also results to misuse of resources, the
Mm-hmm.
country resources. And there are some other challenges, even to the coming even to the rising of the cost of living to people. So still owning car contribute on that to you who bought a car and to the people that are next to you or to the whole country, if I can say it like that. So I think that also can be considered as a solution, like having a policy in place that remit people to own their own car. So and then we have to use our private car to reduce the footprint, carbon footprint to people, how people contribute to the emissions. So and then we have such mechanism of public transport which are very efficient. So that's I think that could be a good solution to the developing countries. And to the developed countries, I think also they have to adapt it as well.
Thank you so much. And indeed, I think yes, a lower use of car can also contribute in the sense that we will need to build a lot of roads for sure. And an efficient use of the public space that we have can also allow us to allocate more space for pedestrians, also cyclists, also for parks and surfaces that are permeable. That, of course, incites in the climate change adaptation. Thank you so much.
Someone just raised their
Okay,
hand.
yeah, sure. I think we still have time for
Yes.
one last.
So if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hello, hi everybody.
Hello, we can hear you.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfectly.
Okay, I want to talk about one of the challenges for climate change in Nigeria. I think the problem of lack of electricity supply has made a lot of Nigerians dependent on generator, and the rate of emission has highly increased because of that. So that's a major issue in Nigeria. Also, pedestrian walkways that would have promoted walking or cycling has been taken over by market traders. Those are major challenges. And most of our roads in Nigeria do not have adequate drainage system. That's another issue and several others. So I believe those are some of the key issues in Nigeria, climate issue in Nigeria that we have. Thank you very much. And addressing that, I think maybe strict regulations should be enforced and the removal of market traders from taking over pedestrian walkways. Also, if our electricity supply can be improved on, so that citizens will not be dependent on generator for survival. Though they'll still have other means of like the solar and all that, but most of Nigerian citizens are dependent on generator instead of the electricity power supply because of the system and all that. So those are the issues we face in Nigeria. The climate issues we face in Nigeria at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, totally agree. The energy, it is an important sector for transportation itself. Of course, if the the production of energy is just done by generators, by private generators, it will create more CO2 emissions for sure. It's not going to be sustainable, way more expensive. And yeah, that has some implications on the reliability of the system itself, of the grid, of the whole electric system. Yes, indeed. And the climate change adaptation also includes that, because if there is a higher increase on utilization by the households on electricity because of higher temperatures, for instance, then yes, it's going to be harder to cope with that demand. Yes, indeed. So, well, just a quick conclusion on the webinar. We have some initial knowledge, and we also presented like an interactive case study, and we opened the floor a little bit to some discussion and exercise that we will consider for the development of our upcoming webinars, but also for the upcoming material and guidelines that are being produced by Mobilize Your City, jointly with resources from them on climate change adaptation. And now I will leave the floor to my colleague Sosha for the session of questions, feedback, and farewell.
Yes, so thank you so much, Milnel, for that great introduction to climate change. I think you laid a really good base foundation of understanding climate change adaptation, increasing the awareness, and then showcasing the vulnerability of mobility, and yeah, highlighting the importance of good urban mobility planning. So just to quickly wrap up, if there are any questions, this is the moment where you can ask. I also, there were a few questions in the chat. One you already, Milnel, answered, but the question was, will copies of the presentation be sent to participants? So of course, this will be available on the YouTube channel, but we will also send out a follow-up email, including this recording and the presentation, so you will have access to both. And also there was a question. So climate adaptation measures are normally related to infrastructure enhancement, and they tend to be costly alternatives compared to regular infrastructure. What kind of measures could we implement in case we want to kick off early action?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to start as early as possible, for sure, and not to wait for new infrastructure to be developed, but also the current infrastructure that we have. And within this regard, it's important to understand what is the emergency, how is the city or the system answering when there is an emergency. So it's important to prioritize these kind of corridors where the emergency vehicles are going to be passing by, in order to make sure that the city keeps functioning and is responsive under these situations of shock. Also, and I already mentioned that before, if a city already has a drainage system, it's important to maintain the drainage system. So specifically during dry seasons, a lot of garbage tends to accumulate in the drainage systems of the cities. And if no proper maintenance is provided during the dry season, once the raining season starts, it's going to be more difficult to evacuate the water, and then it's going to create a flood unnecessarily, because the capacity is there, but it's not fully used. So that would be like a quick win, let's say, to start on climate change adaptation on the infrastructure. Also, of course, the development of redundant infrastructure. And I will mention my example again. If you have a sidewalk in one side of the road, but you also have a sidewalk in the other side of the road, maybe it will be less likely that both of them are going to be flooding at the same time. Of course, under more or less normal conditions or just a little bit of rain. But if you have more links in the city, more sidewalks, bike paths, or more lines of public transportation, then you will be able to deliver the service even in situations of stress. And that's also an example from the exercise, from the case study. For instance, with the public transportation, as it is mostly based on buses, then you have the flexibility that they can take some other roads, but you have to make sure that those corridors that are being used by public transportation are still available under stress circumstances. For sure, those corridors are also being used by the emergency vehicles as well.
So just, do you have specific tools to assess the risk?
There are specific tools to assess the risk. Yes, there's one tool from CIP40, this one that is here, that you can Let me check if that is that one. Yeah, I think it's that one. To assess the risk, specifically to assess the risk. And that includes like a whole checklist on what are the hazards, the vulnerabilities, and how can you measure that in order to assess the risk, also the capacities of the city. So yes, that's a specific tool that we will share also for the within the email that Sosha sent, that Sosha mentioned. So we will also share those guidelines. For Mobilize Your City, we are also going to include part of perhaps not the whole guideline because it's already there, but we will mention how the assessment can be done.
All right, so I feel we can conclude the questions. If you think of some questions later, please feel free to reach out to us directly and we will do our best to answer you by email. And now again, Milal, thank you so much for speaking today. I also want to thank everyone for joining us and participating in this webinar. If you enjoyed the content today and would like to get updates about Mobilize Your City and any future sessions, you can subscribe to our newsletter in your preferred language of Spanish, English, or French. And you can do so by scanning the QR code on the slide. And you can also see any of our previous webinars also through scanning the other QR codes. These are upcoming trainings and events this month, so you can also go ahead and register through clicking the links. And yes, that's it. Thank you so much for everyone who could join us today. And remember that this is the first session of 4, so please be on the lookout for the future sessions. And absolutely, let's stay in touch. These are our social media handles, so please follow us and please feel free to reach out to us anytime. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Milal, again.
Thank you again, Sosha, and thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoyed the webinar, of course, and we wish you a very good day. Thank you.
Have a great day. Thank you.